alaikum. How lovely to see all of you here today. Thank you for coming. And thank you for joining us for the launch of the first book by a woman on Karachi's police. I think it's a great achievement, and I'm very, very happy to be here today. So the book Insecure Guardians is the outcome of Zoha Waseem's PhD. My name is Mahim Maher, and I'm a journalist. I'm currently the digital editor for Aaj TV, but I spent a lot of time running Karachi's city pages at the Daily Times and Express Tribune. We are meeting 2 days after the TTP's attack on the KPO. And in my mind, that will prompt a reaction from all of the concerned citizens of Karachi, policymakers, I assume the federal government, and definitely the police. And so I would urge that anyone who is concerned about policing in Karachi and what happens should read this book. The last time, and correct me if I'm wrong, Omar, the TTP attack, it was 8 years ago at the airport. And if we do not want to see history repeat itself, perhaps this book is something that can guide us into a better future. I'm very grateful that DIG Omar Shahid is here with us today. I'm a great fan of his work. I also see some former police officers and serving police officers here in the audience. Aapko salam. And unfortunately, we will not have time for a Q&A, which really sucks, but Zoha is available afterwards, and she is on Twitter. Just to introduce Zoha very quickly, she is an assistant professor at the University of Warwick, and this book is the outcome of her PhD in security studies at King's College London. She works on policing, militarization, armed violence in places like Pakistan. Omar, I think he's a well-known name at KLF because he is a best-selling author of crime fiction, which I absolutely love. But he is a senior counterterrorism officer with 20 years of experience, and his arrests of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda certainly made him a target as well. So he has served this city. Zoha, so what does the title mean, Insecure Guardians? Let's talk about that.
Sure. If it's okay, I'm going to just give a brief overview of the book first. Can you guys hear me fine if I sit like this? Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizers, especially Salman Saab, Rahila, Muniza, and others for putting together this panel. Thank you also to Mahim and Omar for taking out the time to read this book, for engaging with it. I'm really looking forward to your thoughts. So as Mahim was saying, I'm sure all of you were following the events on Friday evening at the Karachi police office. The next morning, Daily Dawn had carried a range of stories on policing in Pakistan. There were reports about the attack on the police in Karachi, of course, and a follow-up story on the attack on the police in Peshawar. There were reports about the police registering an FIR against Imran Khan on terrorism charges, and about the judiciary getting involved in the transfer of Lahore's top cop. There were reports of extrajudicial killings of 2 rapists in Islamabad, and a leopard on the loose that had initiated a police hunt for Namaloom Afraad. This sheer range of reports in one paper, all on the same day, tell a story of how the police are key agents at the center of wide-ranging conflicts in Pakistan: ethnic insurgencies, religious militancy, political violence, vendettas and victimization, civil-military tensions, and organized crime. They have been and remain crucial for the state to exercise its sovereignty and assert its legitimate violence. They are crucial to regime security and are essential for creating, disrupting, or reshaping political orders. Because of this political role, policing agencies are also instruments of intimidation, fear, and insecurity, thus shaping social structures and determining interactions between social groups and classes. Of course, in countries such as Pakistan, they're also the first to bear the brunt of anger and agitation against the state, often the first to lose legitimacy should they have much to begin with. Frequently victims of problematic security policies designed by such states, and objects of bureaucratic procedures and processes designed to deflect blame away from the state. Caught at the varied and complex intersections of inherently insecure post-colonial regimes and diverse post-colonial societies, the police are therefore also one of the most insecure institutions in countries such as Pakistan. So in this book, I critically explored and discussed some of these dynamics through the case of Karachi and how the institutional culture of the police has developed here over the decades. While being distrusted and at times despised, they are also one of the most neglected and understudied institutions in the country, a gap that my book is trying to address. So the conceptual contribution that is basically being made through this book is a post-colonial perspective on policing. Very simply, the perspective seeks to capture both colonial continuities that we see in the field of policing, as well as post-colonial developments and decisions that have consciously and routinely retained specific traits and features of colonial policing in broader pursuance of regime security, sometimes packaged and delivered as national security. These traits we have observed over the many decades, both during the British Raj, as well as during subsequent military and civil and military regimes in Pakistan. The first of these traits that I'm talking about in the book is the persistence of militarism in policing, or what we generally understand now as police militarization. This is the institutionalization of warfare and militarism or military ethos, ideologies, practices, logics, and materials within so-called civilian police forces. You may notice the presence of militarism in policing these days when you hear certain metaphors, such as the police being on the front lines in the war on terror, that they are fighting a war against street crime, and that they too are our soldiers. The second of these traits is the persistence of informality in police work. Informality is the allowance and space purposefully created for certain unofficial norms, unofficial practices, behaviors, relationships that go beyond what is legal or what is formal, or beyond the legal or formal discretion typically afforded and allowed for police officers. Militarism and informality work together and manifest together in multiple ways, seeping into routine police work. They can manifest in the ways lower-ranked officers try to survive on the job under intense institutional pressures and resource constraints, often colluding with politically patronized criminals, as we have seen in the case of Liari, shaking down the local hawker for weekly bhatta, or extorting daily commuters for chai pani ke paise, or even miscalculating threats that can end innocent lives. They can manifest through the directions given to officers to meet certain demands of external patrons, for example, creatively and innovatively by employing jugaad in their everyday police work, or by acting totally off the books and engaging in extra-legal practices, including sometimes the excessive use of force and police vigilantism or political victimization, because the national interest or qaum ki hifazat so demands it. They can also manifest through organized forms of institutional corruption, and they can manifest through the often haphazard creation of specialized policing units or elite units that are accorded greater powers of coercion and glossier technologies of violence in exchange for lucrative positions and greater access to power and money. But while militarization and informality have been essential to police work and performance, they can frequently work together to compromise both the sense of security felt in society as well as the personal and professional security of police officers themselves. Despite this, there has been little desire on the part of the state and our regimes to bring structural changes into post-colonial policing that can address these institutional fault lines. And there is little reflection on why they have been placed on the front lines like soldiers. Is that where they should be? Who placed them there? And what are the impacts of such positioning and placement on routine police performance and practice? To explore how militarization and informality have been allowed to persist and co-produce, I explore in my book a number of key relationships. So first I explore relations within the organization between senior officers and junior officers, or PSP officers and non-PSP officers. This relationship, I suggest, is one of the central examples of how colonial continuities are sustained and allowed to be retained, especially in the way lower ranked officers or non-PSP officers are groomed to deliver on certain state policies, security policies, draconian laws, and elite demand, the delivery of which has been demanded despite the often inhumane, marginalizing, and vulnerable conditions in which the bulk of the force finds itself and often operates, and the class-based discrimination it faces. Second, I explore relations between the police and external stakeholders, such as political parties, the media, the judiciary, and private actors. The exploration of these relational dynamics between the police and other institutions is critical for understanding how malpractices that we often associate as just bad police work, such as encounter killings, torture, corruption, etc., are also actually products of the demands made by these external institutions that seek to secure and further their own gains. This is equally true in the case of the final relationship that I explore in the book, that of the police and the Sindh Rangers, the other policing actor in Karachi. As I argue, the institutional culture of Karachi police is not just influenced by how the civilian elite have sought to mobilize and instrumentalize the police, but also how civil and military elites have sought to populate the landscape of policing, in which multiple law enforcement agencies now compete for power, control, legitimacy, and credit. In exploring these historical and political and relational institutional dynamics, the book argues that post-colonial policing in contexts such as Pakistan has been characterized by insecure states and insecure regimes striving for security and placing excessive demands on the police, resulting in a persisting and calculated dependency on militarized and informal policing practices. This condition has a direct bearing on how the culture of post-colonial policing has developed and evolved in Pakistan. The responsibility for this should not just start and end with individual officers or a particular thana or a particular specialized policing unit, but must also be extended to other corridors of power, both domestic and global, within which colonial logics of policing and securitization are continually reproduced and co-produced. So thank you for listening. That was a bit of an overview, but I'm looking forward to your thoughts and your questions and comments.
Right.
Thanks, Omar and Mahim.
Yeah, so Omar, I don't know how this makes you feel, but I imagine that you may have seen and felt as an officer yourself that there is a militarization of police. Is this a really old thing in your mind, or it's something that's developed? And I'm curious, my question is, internally, when all the top brass sit down, have they been aware that the new normal is this militarization that has crept in? Is that something that you are cognizant of as a force?
Thanks, Mahim. First of all, again, I think kudos to Zoha for producing this work. She's not just the first woman to have written about policing in Pakistan or in this city, but I believe she's the first person to ever do that. And it's a tremendous piece of work. You know, the question of militarization, I would look at it in two perspectives. One a sort of historical perspective and one a present global perspective. The historical perspective of it is that I would rephrase that question and ask that actually has the police structure as we have it, not just in this city but in Pakistan generally, ever been demilitarized? Because its colonial origins were based upon militaristic structures. When the Sindh police or the Punjab police was founded, its founding members were seconded from the military. In Sindh, they were seconded from Sir Charles Napier's army. And so and because it was a tool for social control and a tool to continue the colonial rule, it always had those militaristic structures. So it's really been a case of never, the coin never having been flipped the other way. The other thing is that obviously post 9/11, and there can be no starker example of this than what happened on Friday at the KPO. There has been a militarization of policing globally. Obviously the threat that is faced by the police is one that requires a degree of greater tactical awareness, which inevitably brings about militarization. And we talk about militarization in a place like Karachi, which has historically had such a backlash of terrorism and all the things that we've seen over the past 20-30 years. But even if you look at any place around the world, I remember a couple of years ago this debate in a small town in the US where the local police department wanted to procure MRAPs, which are sort of armored personnel carriers from the US Department of Defense. And I think it was Peoria, Illinois, and I would really struggle to understand why the police department of Peoria, Illinois would require the same vehicle that is used in counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan. In the UK, where policing ethos has been centered around unarmed policing and sort of policing as a service rather than a force, we have had a gradual creeping militarization. So now if you go to London, you'll see more armed cops on the beat, which was never the case previously. And it's always in response to a threat level being at orange or red or whatever the codification may be. So in that environment, it's no surprise, and I would say it's not just is it not a surprise, but also in light of the threat that is faced, there is a requirement for a degree of militarization. Now, how far that goes will always be a key issue in policing, right? This whole question of balancing whether the police is a force or a service. And that balancing act, I think, is something that not just us in Pakistan, but people, police forces around the world are struggling to kind of to cope with.
I think the idea of the police, you mention in the book a lot that they're not there to serve the community. They're not people-centric. I want to read a quote just so that it becomes a little clearer. In 2018, there was District South's police involved in a crossfire with armed robbers who were spotted mugging a couple at a traffic signal. And a 10-year-old child in the back of the car was killed, Amal. Amal's mother, Zoha, has quoted her. She said, "We question the systems that have made us so regressive that we are fighting street crime on the streets of an independent country with assault rifles, where 7 bullets from an AK-47 are fired by a constable to kill one bandit at point blank. But he fired so aimlessly that he managed to kill an innocent child who was sitting in her car." So we see these manifestations of the militarization, whether it's Naqibullah Mahsood, whether we see the AD Khwaja case or the APC buying scandal. You've mentioned this book is fantastic for, if there are any reporters here, the history of how the laws were made, like the ATA, which brought in a lot of rules that allowed for militarization. But she also has a fantastic look at the CPLC and Rangers. And so what you're saying, which degree and the special units, I want to ask you, how should we view these other units like the SSU, the CPLC, and the Rangers? Because there's also this thing of the policization of the military that happens. So should we have the Rangers doing police work in Karachi? And what is the CPLC doing? Because their data is from the newspapers, so it's not very good.
Yeah, data is always questionable when you're doing research in places like Pakistan, especially on crime and crime data, etc. And each force seems to have its own data on a range of armed violence and armed crimes in the city. Lots of complex and very layered, ideas being explored here, both in terms of the legacy of the colonial legacy of militarization, and I just want to say at that time as well, when they were deciding, what kind of police system to create, there was also discussions happening at that time about how militarized does the force have to be. So in terms of, and he's right, in terms of the fact that was there ever a time that the professional police, as we know it in the subcontinent, was ever non-militarized or demilitarized? I'm not sure, because I think a very calculated decision was made we need to create a coercive apparatus that will secure the regimes, the colonizers' economic and political interests, and suppress all forms of dissent and all forms of insurgency, all forms of protests, etc. So the insecurity of the state at that time was quite real, and in order to kind of prevent any kind of political agitation, they needed to have a coercive apparatus, both the military and the police. So there was never a very clear divide between a civilian structure of policing and a military, essentially. So that kind of blurred line between both the green and blue, as some people say, there was a very blurred line in between that. And I think the repercussions of that we saw, very early on, both before partition as well as after partition. And I think the creation of specialized units such as SSU, the paramilitary, etc., that are all kind of part of that ongoing militarization of policing. And Omar is right, is that there are global trends. And I would say, in fact, those global trends are not just sort of witnessed, they did exacerbate after 9/11 and the war on terror and the onset of the war on terror. But we've seen that in Karachi as well, sort of, during the 80s, the creation of specialized units. We've seen that in the 90s when the Rangers were brought in, and the kind of real impact they've had on the culture of policing in the city, not just in terms of being a straightforward competitor to the police, but also becoming something that the police have. I'm generalizing here, of course, because some officers do have good coordination with the paramilitary and armed forces here. But what it also does is that it can create a bit of an inferiority complex in the police, that, oh look, the Rangers can get away with a lot more, they have a lot more legitimacy, they have much less public accountability, because they just have that kind of barrier with the police and with the public, and we don't. We have to sort of face a lot more criticism. People are a lot more vocal in their criticism about us than they are about the armed forces. So then starting to look at the older brother or the other brother in that way, can result in more of that creeping militarization into the police, who then desire to become more like the armed forces in Pakistan, right? And that can then backfire. And the case of Amal, for example, that you have talked about, and Amal's killing, the killing of the 10-year-old girl, is a prime example of how that can backfire, right? Because you are sort of creating an environment in which you have multiple security operations with very little accountability, in which a lot of free hand is then given to police officers to act outside the law, but sometimes the laws are also created in a way to protect the police and allow certain practices that were before that illegal or informal, right? The laws kind of formalize certain excessive use of force practices, extrajudicial practices, etc. So when they're given that cover in a very sort of insecure environment, when they've been given, when they're sort of told by the courts, told by political parties that take a free hand, take a zero tolerance approach, then that can misfire. And it can misfire because their institutional insecurities and institutional weaknesses have not been addressed, right? And that's the kind of paradox that the book also explores. And I think the idea for that you were asking earlier about where the title comes from. And I'd just like to quote one short quote. It was written by the late senior journalist Talat Aslam, and it was written in the late 1980s, and it still rings true today, and it's very similar to the quote that was written by Amal's mother, and it shows you both the simultaneous empowerment of the police and the disempowerment of the police, and the repercussions of militarizing a very insecure institution. So he was writing in the 1980s when there was sort of, when violence was at a peak and everything. And he wrote that the ordinary policeman occupies a curiously paradoxical position in society. He is both extremely powerful and extremely weak. His status is extremely low, his conditions of pay appalling, and the terms of service disgraceful. Yet he has considerable powers at his disposal, not many checks on how he uses them, and a gun at his side. The combination is lethal. So that kind of gives you an insight into the paradox that we're talking about, both the simultaneous empowerment and disempowerment, and how it can result in the killing not just of civilians. Go ahead.
I'd like to respond to that. And I think it's an interesting point because the case of Amal actually encapsulates the challenges and the issues that you've tried to highlight in a very, very compact way. I was the SSP at the time. The issue, of course, there are no two opinions about the fact that the killing of an infant is a tragedy anywhere in the world, no matter what the circumstances may be. The police officers involved, and I'd like to disagree on the fact that you've termed it as an extrajudicial killing. Actually, if you look at it in terms of any kind of code of conduct anywhere in the world, it was a legitimate encounter because it was not like in the case of Nakibullah or many others, a pre-planned thing. Two police officers on patrol observe robbers mugging a series of cars. They respond to them, they're fired upon, and in response they fire back. Amal's mother's point is a absolutely legitimate one, that why did the police officers have AK-47s? Granted. However, again, I say this 48 hours after an attack on the office of the Karachi police chief, where the assailants have used grenades, suicide jackets, and assault rifles. So, one of the when the police termed its response in the Supreme Court, one of the points that we raised was that this happened in the middle of the Karachi operation, where we've gone over this whole thing of no-go areas and the vulnerability of police officers, of day-to-day of constables on the beat. And so how do you again find that balance? I totally agree. I think an AK-47 is not an ideal weapon to be used in an urban environment. But if someone is attacking those same police officers with a suicide jacket and an RPG, how do I address that? It's a real problem and a challenge for police leaders. And that's why, as I said, and the other aspect of it is, which comes into it, is the lack of public trust, right? So around all of the themes that you've written in your book is this severe lack of public trust in the issue. Same case, and we've seen so many police killings happen in the US, where, having seen the CCTV footage or whatever, whether it was George Floyd or Trayvon Martin or whatever, those acts cannot be just. So I, as a police officer, cannot justify those killings. However, the number of convictions, in fact, forget convictions, the number of times that police officers have even been prosecuted by a district attorney is negligible. Because the general culture seems to fall in the way of, in favor of the police, whereas over here, the same police officers have, for carrying out their duty as they saw fit, been prosecuted, been arrested, and had to go through a whole gamut of the law. So again, it's how we kind of define that.
Yeah, definitely a very complicated dynamic, and good to have the perspectives of a practitioner also. I'm very much kind of an outsider, so it's I'm sort of writing it from a more critical perspective, although I feel like my book can be quite nuanced in some ways. But I think you're right. It was the incident, not it wasn't extrajudicial. I don't think in the book I mentioned it as extrajudicial. It was more like a misfire. It was more just that the car was being mugged. The family was being mugged, and the police were coming fresh out of 5 years of the operation in which they had been given the free hand. And that's what I mean, like when, in the book I talk a lot about the conflation of issues, the conflation of crime with terrorism, the conflation of mugging with a security threat, And when that kind of conflation happens, then it's very risky, because then the police can treat every issue that can be resolved in other ways through a security threat perspective, right? Every issue is seen through a security lens. So that mugger was potentially also seen as a threat. And when you're coming fresh out of a very militarized operation, that then risks sort of retaliating to even an incident of mugging the way you would potentially retaliate to somebody who's coming after you for a targeted attack. So that's the kind of risk that the book that tries to talk about when you're conflating various issues.
One of the things I really like about the book is, I think I have a very good relationship with Karachi's police. I really love them. But the problem is that most people look at them, they're not respected enough, and yet we demand that they protect us. And one of the great things about this book is that it's balanced. You really go into their working conditions and where it's not fair and where there's confusion. And so I would urge, especially, and I wanted to ask both of you about the way the media reports on the police. I don't think we've done a good job of it at all. But can it be possible? I think all the WhatsApp syndicate crime reporter groups, the police giving information, there's also the public trust. We work to build that, and yet we forward narratives of securitization. And I often feel that sometimes the media loves the police. We have the super cop syndrome, like Chaudhry Aslam Saab, and then when we want to beat up on the police and vilify them, they're taking the hit, which is often perhaps not fair, like Omar is saying. So both of you, I wanted to ask about the role of the media, and I mean, I'm not terribly happy with it.
Yeah, but you're the expert on media, so that should be your question. I should be posing that to you. No, I think, again, I saw a fairly complex, and I think a complex relationship between journalists and police officers. It's a very need-based relationship on the one hand. They both need each other, right? The police needs the media to set a particular kind of image and narrative and perception of the police, right? The media needs, journalists, crime reporters need the police to kind of feed them information, corroborate facts, help them sort of, in their own investigative journalism on the other hand, right? At the same time, the media also needs to sometimes, I feel, see which way the public narrative and public debate is going. So before Naqibullah Masood's killing, we do see the kind of glorification of your super cop, the glorification of encounter cops, the encounter specialists, because there was an appetite. I feel there has been an appetite over multiple periods of time because of whatever prevailing insecurity and uncertainty in the city, because of people's own fears and vulnerabilities. There has been an appetite for taking a zero tolerance approach towards certain kinds of elements, right? So the public conversation was very much at one point in favor of such policing practices, right? So the media reported accordingly. That's one way. But then when the public conversation, especially on social media, shifted after Naqibullah Masood's killing, I think the media sort of narrative and projection of policing also shifted. So it's varied. I don't think it's ever been consistently a very good projection either. It varies, but on specific issues like extrajudicial killings, it can also, the journalists will also see what does the public want at that time. What do you think, Omar?
I agree. I think, especially in Karachi and sort of being the media capital of Pakistan, this relationship is supercharged over here, right? The media, especially the crime reporters, need, as Zoha said, need the police. And this kind of pattern has emerged where you have this phenomenon of the super cop, right? So the media creates these super cops. The number of reporters who were kind of fed at the hand of Rao Anwar and who subsequently turned on him when things went south for him is symptomatic of that. And it's a tough one because in that kind of environment and in an environment where crime reporters and especially on TV channels are competing in a very, very small space. It's 30 seconds. If you can get a lead ticker 30 seconds ahead of everyone else, that makes your day. It's tough to pull back and move to the kind of objective, nuanced journalism that perhaps would be more ideal or perhaps is there in other countries. As I see it, I think unfortunately because of this confluence of events, you'll find this kind of I'd call it more tabloidy, right? The way we report on crime. It's more sort of, rather than a...
Sensational.
Yeah, it's more sensational like that. This
Chaudhry
kind of thing
Aslam,
will continue.
Yeah. Okay, I'm very sorry, but we have to wrap up. But I want everybody to buy this book because it's great. If I find any journalist in the crowd who does not read this book and buy it.
I mean, it's fairly expensive, so if you want
take my copy.
An e-copy, I'm happy to share it.
The chapters on the CPLC and Rangers are great. It's full of examples for new sub-editors, new journalists. It's a full background. It's everything you need to know about the police. And if you think what you see out there on the streets is not normal, and if you want to support your force and support them properly, I recommend you read this. Thank you, Zoha.
Thank you
you,
so much.
Omar. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you so much for coming and listening. Thank you. Thank you both.